The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked alongside his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, through the rose gardens. At just 9 years old, the young prince had already shown remarkable composure and kindness that surprised even seasoned royal observers. His sandy hair caught the gentle breeze as he listened intently to the Queen's stories about the different varieties of roses that had been planted decades before he was born. "This particular rose was planted when your grandfather was just about your age," the Queen said softly, pointing to a magnificent pink bloom. Prince George nodded thoughtfully, his blue eyes reflecting genuine interest in every word his great-grandmother shared. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing year, and palace staff often remarked on how the young prince seemed to understand the weight of royal tradition while maintaining the innocent wonder of childhood. As they continued their walk, Prince George noticed something that would change the course of that ordinary Tuesday morning. Near the castle's main entrance, a new security guard stood at attention. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, with graying temples and a slight tremor in his hands that he tried desperately to hide. What caught Prince George's attention wasn't the guard's professional demeanor or his crisp uniform, but something much more subtle: the way the man's eyes seemed to hold a deep sadness, and how he occasionally wiped them when he thought no one was looking. The guard, whose name was Thomas Mitchell, had been hired just 2 weeks earlier. He had served in the British Army for 20 years before taking early retirement due to a medical condition that affected his nervous system. The tremor in his hands was mild but noticeable, and he worried constantly about whether he was performing his duties adequately. More troubling for Thomas was a personal tragedy that had shaken his world just 3 months earlier: the loss of his 8-year-old daughter, Emma, to a rare form of childhood cancer. Prince George had an unusual ability to read people's emotions, something his parents, Prince William and Catherine, had noticed since he was very young. Where other children might run past adults without a second thought, George often paused to observe, to understand, to connect. His teachers at Lambrook School had mentioned this quality in their reports, noting how he would comfort classmates who were upset or include children who seemed left out during playtime. That morning, as the Queen concluded their garden tour and they began walking back toward the castle, Prince George found himself glancing repeatedly at the guard. Something about the man's posture, the way he held himself so rigidly as if fighting an internal battle, resonated with the young prince. He had seen that same look in his own reflection during difficult times, like when his pet hamster had died the previous year, or when he had to say goodbye to his beloved nanny who had moved to care for her aging mother. "Great-grandmama," Prince George said quietly as they approached the castle entrance. "May I ask you something?" The Queen, who had always encouraged her great-grandchildren to speak their minds, nodded with interest. "Of course, my dear. What is it?" "Sometimes people look sad, even when they're trying to look strong, don't they?" the young prince asked, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. The Queen followed his gaze toward the guard and immediately understood. Her own eyes, experienced in reading the subtle signs of human emotion after decades of meeting people from all walks of life, had also noticed the man's barely concealed grief. "Yes, George," she replied gently. "Sometimes people carry heavy hearts while still trying to do their duty. It shows great strength of character." As they passed through the entrance, Prince George made a decision that would demonstrate the kind of monarch he might one day become. Instead of walking directly past the guard as protocol typically dictated, he slowed his pace and made direct eye contact with Thomas. For a moment, the two stood looking at each other, a 9-year-old future king and a middle-aged man struggling with loss, and something passed between them that transcended their vastly different circumstances. The guard, Thomas, was momentarily surprised. He had been trained on proper protocol when interacting with members of the royal family, which primarily consisted of maintaining professional distance unless specifically addressed. He straightened his posture even more, if that were possible, and prepared to offer the standard respectful nod that his position required. But Prince George did something unexpected. Instead of the brief acknowledgement that Thomas anticipated, the young prince stopped walking entirely and offered a warm, genuine smile. It wasn't the practiced smile of royal photographs or public appearances, but the natural, empathetic expression of a child who recognized pain in another person and wanted to offer comfort. "Good morning," Prince George said simply, his voice clear and kind. "Thank you for keeping us safe." Thomas was taken aback. In his military career, he had met various dignitaries and officials, but none had spoken to him with such genuine warmth. especially not a child who would one day inherit the throne. The simple acknowledgement of his service, delivered with such sincerity, touched something deep within him that had been numb since Emma's death. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, his voice slightly thick with emotion. "It's an honor to serve." Prince George nodded thoughtfully, and, for a moment, it seemed as if he wanted to say something more. His great-grandmother watched with interest, recognizing in her great-grandson the same intuitive understanding of people that had served her well throughout her long reign. The Queen had learned that sometimes the most profound connections happen in the briefest moments, and she sensed that something significant was occurring between the young prince and the guard. What happened next would be talked about in hushed, reverent tones among the castle staff for months to come. Prince George, instead of continuing on his way, took a small step closer to Thomas and asked quietly, "Are you settling in well here? Is there anything you need?" The question was so unexpected, so genuine, that Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Here was a child, barely 9 years old, asking about his well-being with the same concern that his late daughter used to show when she sensed that he was worried about work or upset about something. The parallel was so striking that Thomas had to take a deep breath to maintain his professional demeanor. "Yes, sir, thank you for asking," Thomas managed to say, though his voice betrayed the emotion he was trying to control. "Everyone here has been very kind." Prince George seemed to sense that there was more beneath the surface, but he also understood intuitively that this wasn't the time or place to probe deeper. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask. We're all part of the same family here." The word family hit Thomas like a physical blow. It had been 3 months since he had felt part of any family. Since Emma's death, his own relatives had struggled to know what to say to him, and he had found himself increasingly isolated in his grief. His wife, Sarah, was dealing with her own overwhelming sorrow, and they had been like two ships passing in the night, each drowning in their own pain without knowing how to reach out to the other. As Prince George and the Queen continued into the castle, Thomas remained at his post, but something fundamental had shifted within him. The brief interaction had reminded him that kindness still existed in the world, that human connection was still possible even in the depths of grief. For the first time since his daughter's death, he felt a tiny spark of something that might, eventually, grow into hope. Inside the castle, the Queen walked in comfortable silence with her great-grandson for several minutes before speaking. "That was very thoughtful of you, George," she said. "You have good instincts about people." Prince George looked up at his great-grandmother, his expression serious. He seemed lonely, great-grandmama. Not just alone, but truly lonely. "I know what that feels like sometimes." The Queen was struck by the maturity of the observation. "And how do you know what loneliness feels like, my dear?" "Sometimes, when everyone's watching and expecting things from you, you can feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people," Prince George replied with startling honesty. "I think maybe it's like that for him, but different, like he lost something important and doesn't know how to find his way back." The Queen stopped walking and looked down at her great-grandson with new understanding. At 9 years old, Prince George was already grappling with the isolation that could come with royal duty, and yet instead of becoming bitter or self-absorbed, he was using that experience to develop empathy for others. It was a quality that would serve him well in the role he would one day inherit, but, more importantly, it spoke to the kind of person he was becoming. "You're quite right," the Queen said softly, "and your kindness today may have meant more to that gentleman than you realize." Sometimes a simple gesture of recognition and respect can be exactly what someone needs to help them through a difficult time. As the morning progressed, and Prince George went about his usual activities, lessons with his tutor, playtime with his siblings, and lunch with his parents, he found himself thinking about the guard. There had been something in the man's eyes that reminded him of his own reflection during his saddest moments, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story there, a reason for the barely concealed pain he had witnessed. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his duties with a slightly lighter step than he had carried for months. The young prince's words echoed in his mind. "We're all part of the same family here." It was such a simple statement, but it had awakened something in Thomas that he had thought was lost forever, a sense of belonging, of purpose beyond just getting through each day. As his shift ended, and he prepared to return home to his empty house and grieving wife, Thomas found himself looking forward to the next day for the first time since Emma's death. He didn't know if he would see Prince George again, or if their brief interaction had been a one-time occurrence, but something had changed. A door that had been firmly closed in his heart had opened just a crack, letting in the first rays of light he had experienced in his darkest season. That evening, as Prince George helped his younger siblings with a puzzle before bedtime, he mentioned the encounter to his mother, Catherine. "Mummy, I met a new guard today. He seemed very sad about something." Catherine, who had learned to pay attention to her eldest son's observations about people, asked gently, "What made you think he was sad, darling?" "His eyes," Prince George replied without hesitation. "They looked the way mine did when Patches died, but sadder. Like something much more important than a pet had gone away and wasn't coming back." The insight took Catherine by surprise. Her son's ability to read emotions and his instinctive compassion never ceased to amaze her. But this observation was particularly perceptive. She made a mental note to perhaps inquire discreetly about the new staff member, not to intrude but to ensure that appropriate support was available if needed. "Did you say anything to him?" Catherine asked. "Just good morning, and thank you for keeping us safe," Prince George replied. "And I told him we're all family here. I thought maybe he needed to know that someone noticed him, really noticed him, not just as a guard but as a person." Catherine felt a swell of pride in her son's instinctive understanding of what it meant to serve others, even at such a young age. This was exactly the kind of empathy and awareness that would make him not just a good king someday, but a good human being always. As night fell over Windsor Castle, two very different people went to sleep with their thoughts intertwined by a brief but meaningful encounter. Prince George drifted off wondering about the guard's story and hoping that his small gesture had helped in some way. Thomas lay awake for the first time in months, not consumed entirely by grief, but thinking instead about unexpected kindness and the possibility that he might, eventually, find a way to heal while still honoring his daughter's memory. Neither of them could have predicted how this simple interaction would grow into something much more significant, touching not only their own lives but rippling outward to affect everyone around them in ways both profound and lasting. The following morning brought with it a gentle rain that tapped against the windows of Windsor Castle like nature's own percussion. Prince George woke earlier than usual, drawn from sleep by thoughts of the guard he had met the day before. As he dressed for the day, he found himself hoping he would see Thomas again, though he wasn't entirely sure why the encounter had stayed with him so vividly. Thomas arrived for his shift 30 minutes early, as had become his habit. The early arrival gave him time to compose himself, to put on the professional mask that his position required. But today felt different. As he took his position near the main entrance, he found himself standing a little straighter, not from military discipline alone, but from a renewed sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in months. The rain had stopped by the time Prince George made his way through the castle corridors for his morning walk. He had convinced his protection officer to take a route that would pass by the main entrance, though he didn't fully admit to himself that he was hoping to see the guard again. As they approached Thomas's post, Prince George felt a flutter of nervous anticipation. Thomas saw the young prince before Prince George saw him, and he felt that same unexpected warmth from the day before. He had spent considerable time the previous evening thinking about their brief conversation, and how the child's simple acknowledgement had affected him so profoundly. When their eyes met again, both felt the recognition of a connection that transcended their different stations in life. "Good morning," Prince George said with the same genuine warmth as before, but this time he paused longer in front of Thomas's position. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, and this time his voice carried a note of genuine pleasure rather than just professional courtesy. Prince George seemed to be considering something, and after a moment, he asked, "Did you have a good evening yesterday?" The question was so normal, so human, that Thomas was momentarily taken aback. In his military service, and in the short time he had been at Windsor, conversations with superiors or dignitaries typically focused on duty, procedures, or formal matters. No one had asked about his evening, his comfort, or his well-being in a personal way for longer than he could remember. "I did. Thank you for asking, sir," Thomas replied, and realized with surprise that it was actually true. For the first time in months, he had experienced an evening that wasn't entirely consumed by grief. Prince George nodded thoughtfully, and Thomas could see the child processing something in his young mind. "I hope you know that what you do here matters," the prince said quietly. "Not just the guarding part, but being here, being yourself. Sometimes that's the most important thing of all." The words were so unexpected, so profound coming from a 9-year-old, that Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure slip slightly. He had spent months feeling utterly useless, as if his presence in the world no longer served any purpose since he couldn't protect the one person who had mattered most to him. To hear that his mere existence had value, especially from someone so young who spoke with such sincerity, touched something deep within his wounded soul. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Thomas managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "That means more than you know." Prince George seemed to understand that he had touched on something significant, though he might not have fully grasped the depth of what Thomas was experiencing. With the intuitive wisdom that often surprises adults when they encounter it in children, he simply nodded and said, "I meant it," before continuing on his way with his protection officer. As the days passed, these brief morning encounters became a routine that both Prince George and Thomas looked forward to. The conversations were always short, mindful of Thomas's duties and the young prince's schedule, but they were genuine and meaningful. Prince George would ask about Thomas's day, comment on the weather, or simply offer a warm greeting. Thomas began to realize that these few minutes each morning were becoming the highlight of his day. What neither of them knew was that their interactions were being observed with growing interest by other members of the castle staff. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, who had served as a housekeeper at Windsor for over 20 years, often worked near the main entrance and had witnessed several of their conversations. She had noticed the gradual change in Thomas's demeanor, how he stood with less rigidity, how his eyes had regained some of their light, and how he seemed to carry himself with renewed dignity. Mrs. Hartley had also observed Prince George's consistent kindness, but what struck her most was the apparent mutual respect between the 9-year-old future king and the middle-aged guard. In her long years of service, she had seen many interactions between royals and staff, and while the family was known for their graciousness, there was something particularly special about watching Prince George engage with Thomas as an equal human being rather than simply acknowledging him as part of the scenery. One particularly meaningful moment occurred on a Thursday morning when Prince George noticed that Thomas's hands were shaking more than usual. The young prince didn't comment on it directly, but instead of their usual brief chat, he lingered a bit longer and began talking about a book he was reading about brave soldiers throughout history. "My tutor told me that real courage isn't about not being scared," Prince George said thoughtfully. "It's about doing what needs to be done even when you are scared or when things are difficult. I think that's quite impressive, don't you?" Thomas understood immediately that the young prince was offering him a gift, recognition of his daily struggle to function normally despite his medical condition and his grief. The message was clear. Prince George saw his effort to continue serving despite his challenges as a form of courage worthy of respect. "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "I think some of the bravest people are those who keep going when no one else realizes how hard it is for them." The exchange was brief, but it cemented something important between them. Prince George had managed to acknowledge Thomas's struggle without making him feel pitted or diminished, while Thomas had shared a piece of wisdom born from his own difficult journey. They were no longer just a royal child and a castle guard exchanging pleasantries. They had become two human beings who recognized and respected each other's strength. Mrs. Hartley, who had overheard this conversation while polishing nearby fixtures, felt tears spring to her eyes. She had known Thomas's story, how he had lost his daughter and was struggling with both grief and a medical condition that threatened his sense of usefulness. Watching Prince George intuitively understand and address these challenges with such grace made her proud not just of the royal family she served, but of humanity itself. That afternoon, Mrs. Hartley found herself in conversation with other long-serving staff members about what they had been witnessing. James Morrison, who had worked in the castle's gardens for 15 years, mentioned that he too had noticed the developing friendship between Prince George and Thomas. "It's remarkable, really," James said as they shared tea during their break. "The young prince treats Thomas with the same respect he shows to visiting dignitaries, but there's something more personal about it. You can see that he genuinely cares about Thomas as a person." Sarah Chun, who worked in the royal household's administrative offices, had also become aware of the morning routine. "I've seen Thomas's personnel file," she said quietly. "He's been through something terrible recently. The fact that Prince George has somehow sensed this and responded with such consistent kindness, it speaks volumes about the kind of person he's becoming." Word of Prince George's daily interactions with Thomas began to spread through the castle's staff, not as gossip, but as a source of quiet pride and inspiration. Many of them had served the royal family for years and had great respect for their commitment to service. But Seeing such natural compassion in the young prince reinforced their belief that the monarchy would be in good hands for generations to come. Prince William and Catherine became aware of their son's routine through conversations with his protection officers and comments from staff. Rather than being concerned about the irregular interactions, they were proud of George's instinctive kindness and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life. They had always hoped to raise their children with a strong sense of empathy and service, and George's behavior demonstrated that these values were taking root naturally. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Prince William brought up the subject casually. "I hear you've been having some interesting conversations with one of our security team members, George." Prince George looked up from his meal, not defensive, but simply matter of fact. "Thomas. He's very kind, and I think he's been sad about something important. I like talking to him." "What do you talk about?" Catherine asked gently, curious about her son's perspective on these interactions. "Different things," Prince George replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes about the weather, or books, or how his day is going. Mostly I just want him to know that someone notices him and thinks he's doing a good job. I think maybe people don't tell him that enough." The insight impressed both parents. At 9 years old, their son had recognized something that many adults miss, that everyone, regardless of their position or circumstances, needs to feel seen and valued. The fact that he was acting on this understanding without any prompting or expectation of recognition showed a level of emotional maturity that filled them with pride. "That's very thoughtful of you," Prince William said. "I'm sure your friendship means a great deal to him." "I hope so," Prince George replied simply. "He seems less sad now than when I first met him. Not happy exactly, but less heavy. Like maybe things might get better someday." The observation was remarkably perceptive. Thomas was indeed experiencing a gradual shift in his emotional state, though he was still very much in the process of grieving his daughter. The daily interactions with Prince George had created a small but significant bright spot in his otherwise dark world, reminding him that connection and purpose were still possible even in the midst of profound loss. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to notice changes in himself that went beyond just looking forward to his morning conversations with Prince George. The young prince's consistent kindness had reminded him of his own capacity for joy and connection, qualities that he had feared were buried forever with his daughter. He found himself engaging more naturally with other staff members, offering help when he saw someone struggling with a task, and even managing to smile genuinely when appropriate. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was real and meaningful. Thomas began to understand that healing didn't mean forgetting Emma or diminishing the love he had for her. Instead, it meant finding ways to honor her memory while still remaining open to the good things that life might offer. Prince George's friendship had become a bridge between the overwhelming grief that had consumed him and the possibility of a future where he could carry his love for his daughter while still engaging with the world around him. One morning, as autumn began to paint the castle grounds in brilliant colors, Thomas arrived at his post to find a small envelope with his name written in careful, childish handwriting. Inside was a drawing that Prince George had made during one of his art lessons. It showed a castle guard standing proudly at his post, with the sun shining brightly overhead, and the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe," written in the margin. The simple gift moved Thomas more than any formal recognition or elaborate gesture could have. Here was tangible proof that their friendship mattered to Prince George as much as it did to him, that the young prince valued him enough to spend time creating something personal and meaningful. Thomas carefully tucked the drawing into his uniform pocket, where it remained throughout his shift like a talisman of hope and connection. When Prince George appeared for his usual morning walk, Thomas thanked him for the drawing with genuine emotion. "Your Royal Highness, the picture you drew for me is beautiful. I'll treasure it always." Prince George beamed with pleasure. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that you're appreciated," he said. "Sometimes when people are going through hard times, they forget that they matter to other people. I didn't want you to forget." The simple statement, delivered with such sincerity by a 9-year-old child, encapsulated everything that Thomas had rediscovered through their friendship. He had indeed forgotten that he mattered, that his presence in the world had value beyond his role as Emma's father. Prince George's consistent kindness had gradually reminded him that he was worthy of friendship, respect, and care, not because of what he could do for others, but simply because of who he was as a human being. As they concluded their conversation that morning, both Prince George and Thomas felt the deep satisfaction that comes from meaningful human connection. Neither of them knew that their friendship was about to face a significant test, one that would demonstrate the true depth of the bond they had formed and revealed just how much their relationship had changed both of their lives. November arrived with an unexpected chill that seemed to settle deep into the stones of Windsor Castle. For Thomas, this time of year carried particular weight. Emma had been diagnosed exactly 1 year ago in November, and the approaching anniversary of that devastating day filled him with a renewed sense of loss that threatened to undo all the progress he had made over the past months. Prince George, with his intuitive sensitivity to the emotions of others, noticed the change in Thomas almost immediately. The guard's shoulders seemed heavier again, his smile more forced, and there was a distant quality to his eyes that reminded the young prince of their very first encounter. Though he didn't understand the specific reason for Thomas's renewed sadness, Prince George recognized the signs and felt compelled to offer whatever comfort he could. On a particularly gray Monday morning, when the mist hung low over the castle grounds and the world seemed wrapped in melancholy, Prince George approached Thomas's post with more than his usual concern. He had woken that morning with an inexplicable feeling that today would be difficult for his friend, though he couldn't explain why. "Good morning, Thomas," Prince George said, deliberately using the guard's first name for the first time. The informal address was a small but significant gesture of intimacy and equality that wasn't lost on Thomas. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Thomas replied, his voice carrying the strain of someone fighting to maintain composure. Prince George studied Thomas's face with the direct, uncomplicated gaze that children can employ when they're trying to understand something important. "You seem especially heavy today," he observed quietly. "Not just tired, but like you're carrying something that's too big for one person to hold alone." The accuracy of the observation took Thomas by surprise. He had been carrying the weight of approaching anniversaries, not just Emma's diagnosis, but also her birthday, which would have been in 3 weeks, and the day she died, which fell in January. The burden felt enormous, made worse by his reluctance to share it with anyone, including his wife, who was dealing with her own version of the same pain. Sometimes certain times of year are more difficult than others, Thomas admitted carefully, not wanting to burden a child with the full weight of his grief, but also feeling compelled to be honest with someone who had shown him such consistent kindness. Prince George nodded with understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "Like how Christmas used to be my favorite time, but now it's harder because that's when great-grandpapa died?" he asked, referring to Prince Philip's passing several years earlier. The parallel wasn't exact, but the emotional truth behind it was clear. Thomas was struck by the young prince's ability to connect their different experiences of loss and find common ground. "Yes," he said simply. "Very much like that." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, both acknowledging the weight of memories that could transform ordinary days into emotional minefields. Then, Prince George did something that surprised even himself. He reached out and gently touched Thomas's arm, a gesture of comfort that transcended all considerations of protocol or appropriate behavior. "I'm sorry you're hurting," Prince George said simply, "and I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone. Even if you can't talk about it, having someone who knows it's hard can help sometimes." Thomas felt tears threatening for the first time since Emma's death, not tears of despair this time, but tears of gratitude for unexpected understanding and acceptance. The young prince wasn't trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes about things getting better. Instead, he was simply acknowledging the reality of pain and offering the gift of witness, someone who saw the struggle and didn't turn away. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Thomas managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me." Prince George seemed to understand that he had touched something profound, and, with the instinctive wisdom that occasionally emerges in children, he didn't try to elaborate or explain. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "I'll be thinking about you today," before continuing on his way. As the day progressed, Thomas found himself drawing strength from that brief interaction in ways that surprised him. Knowing that somewhere in the castle, a 9-year-old prince was genuinely concerned about his well-being created a sense of connection that helped him navigate the difficult hours ahead. When waves of grief threatened to overwhelm him, he reminded himself of Prince George's words and found that the burden felt slightly more manageable when shared, even if only in spirit. That evening, Prince George mentioned the encounter to his parents during dinner, expressing concern for Thomas's obvious distress. "I think something very sad happened to Thomas around this time last year," he told them quietly. He seemed like he was remembering something terrible. Catherine and Prince William exchanged a meaningful look. They had both learned to trust their eldest son's instincts about people, and his observation prompted them to make some discreet inquiries. Through appropriate channels, they learned about Thomas's loss and began to understand the full context of their son's friendship with the grieving guard. The knowledge didn't change their support for the relationship. If anything, it increased their respect for both Prince George's natural compassion and Thomas's strength in continuing to serve despite his personal tragedy. However, it did make them more aware of the significance of what was developing between their son and Thomas, and they resolved to provide whatever support might be appropriate. 2 days later, Prince George appeared at Thomas's post carrying a small wrapped package. "I made something for you," he said simply, offering the gift with the unself-conscious generosity that characterized his interactions with the guard. Inside the wrapping was a small wooden plaque that Prince George had crafted during his woodworking lessons with the castle's craftsmen. On it, he had carefully carved the words, "Brave hearts carry on," along with a simple design of a sun emerging from behind clouds. The workmanship was clearly that of a child, with slight imperfections that only added to its charm and authenticity. Thomas was deeply moved by the gift, but what touched him most was the message it conveyed. Prince George had somehow understood that Thomas was struggling with questions about his own courage and strength, wondering if continuing to function in the face of devastating loss made him brave or simply cowardly for not surrendering entirely to his grief. "I thought you should know that carrying on when your heart is broken is one of the bravest things anyone can do," Prince George explained as Thomas examined the plaque. "My great-grandmother told me that real strength isn't about not feeling sad or scared. It's about feeling those things and still choosing to keep going, to keep being kind to other people, to keep doing your duty even when it's hard." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone so young, struck Thomas with the force of revelation. For months, he had been questioning his own character, wondering if he was dishonoring Emma's memory by continuing to live, to work, to occasionally experience moments of peace or even fleeting happiness. Prince George's gift and words reframed his struggle in a way that allowed him to see his daily efforts to function not as betrayal or cowardice, but as a form of courage. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." Prince George smiled with genuine pleasure. "I wanted you to have something to remind you of how brave you are, especially on the really hard days." As November progressed toward its most difficult anniversary, Thomas found himself returning again and again to Prince George's words and the small wooden plaque that now sat prominently on his dresser at home. The gift had become more than a simple memento of their friendship. It had transformed into a source of strength that helped him navigate the approaching anniversary of Emma's diagnosis. The relationship between Prince George and Thomas had also begun to influence others around them in unexpected ways. Mrs. Hartley, who continued to observe their interactions with admiration, found herself inspired to reach out to other staff members who seemed to be struggling with personal challenges. The young prince's example of looking beyond someone's professional role to see their humanity had reminded her of the power of simple kindness in the workplace. James Morrison, the gardener, began making a point of checking on Thomas during his breaks, offering companionship without prying into personal matters. Sarah Chun from the administrative offices occasionally brought Thomas a cup of tea during his shift, a small gesture that acknowledged his worth beyond his function as a security guard. The ripple effects of Prince George's compassion were creating a more supportive environment for everyone. On the anniversary of Emma's diagnosis, Thomas arrived at work unsure whether he would be able to fulfill his duties effectively. The date had loomed in his consciousness for weeks, and despite all the progress he had made, he feared that the weight of memory might prove too overwhelming. He had barely slept the night before, and his hands were shaking more than usual as he took his position. Prince George appeared earlier than usual that morning, as if he had sensed that this was a day when his friend would need extra support. Without being told the significance of the date, he seemed to understand that today carried special weight for Thomas. "I wanted to make sure I saw you this morning," Prince George said simply. "I had a feeling you might need a friend today." The intuitive accuracy of the observation left Thomas momentarily speechless. How could a 9-year-old child so perfectly read his emotional state and respond with exactly the kind of support he needed? The answer, he was beginning to understand, lay in the remarkable empathy that seemed to be at the core of Prince George's character. "You're right," Thomas admitted. "Today is difficult, but knowing you were thinking of me helps more than you realize." Prince George nodded with understanding. "Some days are like that. The calendar can be cruel sometimes, marking days that we wish we could skip entirely. But maybe the fact that those days hurt so much is also proof of how much love we carry. The profound observation took Thomas's breath away. In a single sentence, Prince George had managed to reframe the pain of anniversaries not as something to be endured or overcome, but as a testament to the depth of love that continued even after loss. It was a perspective that Thomas had never considered, one that allowed him to honor his grief rather than fight against it. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Thomas said softly. "Thank you for helping me see it differently." As Prince George continued on his way that morning, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The day was still difficult, still marked by waves of sadness and memory, but it no longer felt like something he had to survive alone. The young prince's friendship had given him a framework for understanding his grief as an expression of ongoing love rather than simply a burden to be carried. That afternoon, for the first time since Emma's death, Thomas called his wife Sarah during his break. Their conversation was brief and tentative, both of them still navigating the complex terrain of shared loss. But it was a beginning. Prince George's example of reaching out with kindness and understanding had reminded Thomas that healing might be possible not through forgetting or moving on, but through finding ways to carry love forward even in the face of absence. The young prince never knew the full impact of his friendship during those difficult November days, but Thomas would later look back on that period as the turning point in his journey through grief. Prince George's intuitive compassion and wise words had provided exactly what Thomas needed to begin transforming his relationship with loss from something that threatened to destroy him into something that, while still painful, could coexist with hope and continued connection to life. As winter began to settle over Windsor Castle, the friendship between a 9-year-old prince and a grieving guard had become a source of strength and inspiration that extended far beyond their daily morning conversations. Their connection had reminded everyone who witnessed it that the most profound healing often comes not from grand gestures or professional interventions, but from simple human kindness offered with sincerity and received with gratitude. December brought with it the first real snowfall of the season, transforming Windsor Castle into a scene from a fairy tale. The grounds sparkled under a blanket of pristine white, and the ancient stones of the castle seemed to glow with warmth against the winter landscape. For Prince George, the snow represented possibility and wonder, but for Thomas, it triggered memories that were both beautiful and heartbreaking. Emma had loved snow more than anything else in the world. Every winter, she would press her face against their living room window, counting the flakes as they fell and begging to build snowmen the moment the ground was covered. Thomas could still hear her delighted squeals as she caught snowflakes on her tongue, and the memory brought both joy and devastating sadness. When Prince George arrived for their morning conversation, he immediately noticed the change in Thomas's expression. The guard was staring out at the snow-covered grounds with an intensity that spoke of deep emotion, and his usual composure seemed more fragile than it had been in weeks. "The snow is beautiful, isn't it?" Prince George said gently, following Thomas's gaze across the winter wonderland that surrounded them. "Yes," Thomas replied quietly. "My daughter, she loved snow. She would have been so excited to see this." The words slipped out before he could stop them, the first time he had directly mentioned Emma to Prince George. Prince George turned to look at Thomas with the serious, thoughtful expression that adults often found surprising in someone so young. "Would have been?" he asked softly, and something in his tone made it clear that he understood the implication of those words. Thomas felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. For months, he had managed to keep his interactions with Prince George separate from his grief, but the sight of the snow and the young prince's gentle inquiry had broken through his defenses. "She died 8 months ago," he said simply. "She was 8 years old. She loved snow and fairy tales and believed that kindness could fix anything." The admission hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Thomas feared that he had burdened a child with more than he could handle. But Prince George's response surprised him once again. "She sounds like she was wonderful," the prince said with genuine warmth. "I think she must have been very proud to have you as her father." The simple statement, delivered without pity or awkward sympathy, touched Thomas more deeply than any of the well-meaning but ultimately empty consolations he had received from others. Prince George hadn't tried to minimize his loss or offer false comfort about Emma being in a better place. Instead, he had focused on the love that had existed between father and daughter, validating both Emma's importance and Thomas's role in her life. "She was extraordinary," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. She had this way of seeing the best in everyone, of finding magic in ordinary moments. In many ways, she reminds me of you. Prince George seemed to consider this comparison seriously. I wish I could have met her, he said finally. But I think maybe I can understand her a little bit through knowing you. Sometimes people live on in the hearts of the people who love them, and in the kindness that those people show to others. The profound observation left Thomas momentarily speechless. Here was a 9-year-old child offering him a perspective on grief and continuity that was more healing than anything he had heard from grief counselors or well-meaning friends. The idea that Emma might live on through the kindness he showed to others reframed his relationship with her memory in a way that felt both comforting and empowering. You're quite wise for someone so young, Thomas said softly. Emma would have loved talking with you. She always said that the best conversations happened when people really listened to each other with their hearts. Prince George smiled at this, clearly pleased by the comparison. Maybe that's what we've been doing all along, he said. Listening with our hearts, I mean. It feels different from regular listening, doesn't it? The insight was remarkable in its accuracy. Their friendship had indeed been characterized by a quality of attention and empathy that went beyond surface politeness or even conventional kindness. Both of them had been listening not just to words, but to the emotions and needs that lay beneath, creating a connection that transcended their very different circumstances. As their conversation continued, Thomas found himself sharing memories of Emma that he hadn't been able to discuss with anyone else. Prince George listened with genuine interest and compassion, asking thoughtful questions about Emma's favorite activities, her personality, and the things that had made her special. The young prince's ability to hear these stories without discomfort or the need to change the subject was a gift that Thomas hadn't realized he desperately needed. She sounds like the kind of person who made the world brighter just by being in it, Prince George observed after hearing several of Thomas's stories. I think people like that never really leave us completely. They become part of how we see the world and how we treat other people. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. By sharing Emma's story with Prince George, Thomas had allowed their friendship to encompass the full reality of his life, including his loss. Rather than diminishing their connection, this deeper level of honesty had strengthened it, creating a bond based not just on mutual kindness, but on genuine understanding and shared emotional truth. Word of Thomas's loss gradually spread among the castle staff, not through gossip, but through the natural concern that colleagues feel for one another. Mrs. Hartley, who had been watching the friendship between Prince George and Thomas develop, was deeply moved when she learned the full context of what she had been witnessing. The young prince's intuitive response to Thomas's grief took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of such profound loss. The knowledge that Thomas was grieving the death of his child prompted a wave of quiet support from throughout the castle staff. James Morrison began bringing Thomas small bouquets from the greenhouse, simple arrangements that brightened his post without calling attention to themselves. Sarah Chun made sure that Thomas received schedule adjustments when he needed them, and Mrs. Hartley occasionally left a thermos of hot soup in the security office with notes that simply said, "From a friend." What was remarkable about this outpouring of support was its subtlety. Rather than overwhelming Thomas with attention that might have felt intrusive, the staff found ways to show care that respected his dignity and his need to continue functioning in his role. The example set by Prince George, offering consistent kindness without pity or dramatic gestures, had created a model that others could follow. Prince George, meanwhile, began incorporating Emma's memory into their daily conversations in ways that honored both her life and Thomas's ongoing love for her. He would ask about traditions that Emma had enjoyed, wonder what she might have thought about current events, or share stories from his own life that might have paralleled her experiences. These references served to keep Emma's presence alive in a healthy way, allowing Thomas to speak about his daughter naturally rather than feeling that her memory was something he had to hide or suppress. One particularly meaningful moment occurred when Prince George noticed that Thomas was wearing a small pin on his uniform that he hadn't seen before. The pin featured a butterfly design in bright colors that seemed incongruous with the formal security attire. "That's a beautiful pin," Prince George observed. "It's very cheerful." Thomas touched the pin gently, his expression softening. "Emma made it for me in an art class at the hospital. She said butterflies were proof that beautiful things could happen even after everything seemed hopeless. She wanted me to wear it so I would remember that transformation was always possible." Prince George studied the pin with the serious attention he gave to all things that were important to people he cared about. "She was right about that," he said thoughtfully. "And I think wearing it shows that you're still listening to her wisdom. That seems like a very good way to honor someone you love. The conversation reinforced something that Thomas had been gradually discovering through his friendship with Prince George, that healing didn't require forgetting Emma or minimizing his love for her. Instead, it meant finding ways to carry that love forward while remaining open to new connections and experiences. The young prince had somehow understood this intuitively, creating space for both grief and hope to coexist in their relationship. As December progressed toward Christmas, Thomas began to face another challenging milestone. The previous Christmas had been Emma's last, and she had been very ill but still determined to celebrate with her characteristic enthusiasm. The memories of that final holiday together were both precious and painful, filled with moments of forced cheer that masked the terrible knowledge that time was running short. Prince George seemed to sense that the approaching holiday was stirring up complex emotions for Thomas, though he didn't press for details. Instead, he began sharing his own experiences with Christmas traditions, describing them in ways that emphasized their deeper meaning rather than just their surface celebration. Christmas has always been about hope, hasn't it? Prince George said one morning as they stood together watching the castle staff hang garlands along the main entrance. Even when things are difficult, there's something about this time of year that reminds us to look for light in the darkness. Thomas nodded, appreciating the young prince's ability to acknowledge the complexity of holiday emotions without dismissing the legitimate sadness that anniversaries could bring. Emma used to say that Christmas magic wasn't about getting everything you wanted, he shared. It was about giving love to people who needed it, even if you couldn't fix everything that was wrong in their lives. Prince George smiled at this wisdom from a child he had never met, but felt he was beginning to know through Thomas's stories. She sounds like she understood something very important about what the holiday really means, he said. Maybe the best way to honor that understanding is to keep looking for ways to give love to people who need it. The simple observation struck Thomas with the force of revelation. For months, he had been so focused on his own pain that he had forgotten one of Emma's most fundamental teachings, that love was meant to be shared, that even in the midst of suffering, there were opportunities to offer comfort to others. Prince George's friendship had been teaching him this lesson gradually, but hearing it articulated so clearly helped him understand what was happening in their relationship. You're absolutely right, Thomas said with genuine gratitude. And you've been showing me how to do exactly that, even though I don't think you realized it. Prince George looked puzzled. How do you mean? By being kind to me when I needed it most, Thomas explained. By seeing me as a person worth caring about when I had forgotten that myself. By listening to stories about Emma and helping me remember that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. You've been giving me exactly the kind of love that she would have wanted me to receive. The young prince seemed deeply moved by this realization. For months, he had simply been following his instincts about friendship and kindness, but understanding that his actions had genuinely helped Thomas heal added new meaning to their relationship. He began to see their connection not just as something that felt good, but as something that had real purpose and value in the world. As Christmas approached, both Prince George and Thomas found themselves looking forward not just to the holiday itself, but to continuing their friendship beyond the specific challenges that had brought them together. What had begun as simple kindness offered to someone who seemed lonely had evolved into a genuine bond that had enriched both of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The snow continued to fall outside Windsor Castle, covering the grounds in pristine white that would have delighted a little girl who believed in the transformative power of beauty and kindness. While Emma would never see another snowfall, her influence lived on in the friendship between her father and a young prince who understood that the most profound healing often comes through the simple act of caring for one another with sincerity and grace. The week before Christmas brought an unexpected announcement that would change everything for Thomas. During a routine staff meeting, it was revealed that due to security reorganization, several guard positions would be transferred to other royal residences. Thomas's name was on the list for reassignment to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, effective after the new year. The news hit Thomas like a physical blow. Just as he was beginning to heal, just as he had found a source of hope and connection that was helping him navigate his grief, he was being asked to leave it all behind. The thought of starting over in a new place, surrounded by strangers who didn't know his story and couldn't understand his journey, felt overwhelming. More than that, the prospect of leaving Prince George filled him with unexpected sorrow. Their friendship had become so central to his daily experience that he couldn't imagine morning routines without their conversations. The young prince had become not just a source of comfort, but a bridge between the devastation of his loss and the possibility of a future where he could carry Emma's memory while still engaging with life. That afternoon, during his break, Thomas found himself sitting alone in the castle's library, staring out at the snow-covered grounds and trying to process the news. He knew that his emotional reaction to the transfer was complicated by his grief. Everything felt more intense, more significant when filtered through the lens of loss. But he also recognized that his connection with Prince George had been genuinely transformative, and the thought of losing it felt like another kind of bereavement. Mrs. Hartley found him there, reading the distress in his posture even before he shared the news. "You look like someone who's received difficult information," she said gently, settling into a chair across from him. Thomas explained about the transfer, and Mrs. Hartley listened with the same compassionate attention that had characterized the entire castle staff's response to his situation. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Have you told Prince George yet?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know how to. He's been so kind, so consistent in his friendship. I don't want him to think I'm abandoning him, but I also don't want to burden him with my disappointment about leaving." Mrs. Hartley considered this carefully. "I think you might be underestimating young Prince George," she said finally. "He's shown remarkable maturity in how he's handled your friendship so far. Perhaps he deserves the truth about what his kindness has meant to you, and the chance to say goodbye properly if that's what this turns out to be." The wisdom in her words resonated with Thomas. Throughout their friendship, Prince George had consistently demonstrated an ability to handle emotional complexity with grace and understanding that far exceeded his years. Treating him as anything less than capable of processing this news would be unfair to both of them. The next morning, Thomas decided to tell Prince George about the transfer. As the young prince approached his post with his usual warm smile, Thomas felt his resolve waver. How do you tell someone who has been a lifeline that you're being forced to let go of the rope? "Good morning, Thomas," Prince George said, then paused, studying his friend's expression with the careful attention he had learned to pay to subtle emotional cues. "You seem worried about something. Is everything all right?" The direct question made it impossible for Thomas to avoid the conversation he had been dreading. "Your Royal Highness, I've received some news that I wanted to share with you. I'm being transferred to another royal residence after the new year. I wanted you to hear it from me rather than discovering it some other way." Prince George's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise to what looked like genuine sadness. For a moment, he said nothing, processing the information with the serious consideration he gave to all important matters. "That's quite sudden," he said finally. "How do you feel about it?" The question surprised Thomas with its directness and emotional intelligence. Rather than focusing on logistics or expressing automatic congratulations about a new opportunity, Prince George was asking about the human impact of the change. It was exactly the kind of response that had made their friendship so meaningful from the beginning. "Honestly," Thomas said, "I'm sad about it. This place, and especially our friendship, has meant more to me than you could possibly know. The thought of starting over somewhere new, without the connections I've built here, feels daunting." Prince George nodded with understanding that seemed far beyond his 9 years. "It must feel like you're being asked to leave behind something that's helped you heal," he observed. "That would be frightening for anyone." The accuracy of the observation left Thomas momentarily speechless. Prince George had managed to identify and articulate exactly what was at the heart of his distress about the transfer. It wasn't just about changing jobs or locations. It was about potentially losing the relationships and routines that had been instrumental in his recovery from devastating grief. "Yes," Thomas said simply. "That's exactly what it feels like." Prince George was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could see him thinking through something important. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "I want you to know that what we've shared here won't disappear just because you're in a different place," the young prince said with quiet conviction. "The kindness you've shown me, the stories you've told me about Emma, the way you've taught me that real strength sometimes looks like just keeping going, all of that becomes part of who I am. You can't take that back by moving away." The profound wisdom in those words took Thomas's breath away. Here was a 9-year-old child offering him a perspective on the permanence of meaningful relationships that many adults never achieve. Prince George was helping him understand that their friendship had created something lasting that couldn't be diminished by physical distance or changed circumstances. And Prince George continued, "I think Emma would want you to take the courage you've found here with you wherever you go. Maybe the purpose of our friendship was partly to help you remember that you're capable of connecting with people, of being valued and appreciated." That doesn't change because you're in Scotland instead of England. Thomas felt tears threaten for the first time in weeks, but they were tears of gratitude rather than despair. Prince George had managed to reframe the transfer from something that would end their connection to something that would test and ultimately prove its strength. More than that, he had helped Thomas see that the healing he had experienced wasn't dependent on external circumstances, but had become part of his internal landscape. "You're remarkable," Thomas said softly. "I came here dreading this conversation, afraid that I was losing something precious. But you've helped me see that what we've shared has already changed both of us in ways that can't be undone." Prince George smiled with obvious pleasure. "That's what real friendship does, isn't it? It makes both people better than they were before, and that improvement doesn't go away when the friends are separated." Over the following days, word of Thomas's impending transfer spread through the castle staff with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized their earlier support for his healing. But rather than treating his departure as a loss, many of them followed Prince George's example and seeing it as an opportunity to celebrate what had been accomplished and to send Thomas forward with confidence in his ability to build new connections. Mrs. Hartley organized a small farewell gathering that focused on the positive changes they had all witnessed in Thomas over the past months. James Morrison created a small garden arrangement that Thomas could take with him, featuring plants that would remind him of Windsor's grounds. Sarah Chun compiled a collection of contact information so that Thomas could maintain connections with colleagues who had become friends. Prince George, meanwhile, began working on a farewell gift of his own. With the help of his art tutor, he created a small leather-bound journal filled with his own thoughts about friendship, courage, and the ways that love continues even when people are separated. On the first page, he wrote, "For Thomas, who taught me that kindness is never wasted, and that the best friendships help both people become who they're meant to be." Throughout the journal, Prince George had included observations about their conversations, memories of significant moments they had shared, and reflections on what he had learned from Thomas about strength in the face of adversity. The final entry read, "Emma lives on in every kind thing you do for others. Take her love with you wherever you go, and remember that distance can't diminish the impact you've had on people who care about you." When Prince George presented the journal to Thomas on his last day at Windsor, both of them struggled to maintain their composure. The gift represented not just a memento of their friendship, but a tangible reminder of the profound connection they had formed across the boundaries of age, social position, and personal circumstance. "This is extraordinary," Thomas said, carefully turning the pages and reading Prince George's thoughtful words. "I will treasure this always, not just as a reminder of you, but as proof that healing is possible and that love really can triumph over loss." Prince George beamed with obvious satisfaction. "I wanted you to have something to remind you that you're capable of making friends wherever you go," he said. "And I wanted you to know that I'll always remember what you taught me about seeing people's hearts instead of just their jobs or their circumstances." As Thomas prepared to leave Windsor Castle for the last time, he realized that his departure felt fundamentally different from what he had expected when he first learned about the transfer. Instead of leaving with a sense of loss and abandonment, he was departing with confidence in his ability to heal while honoring Emma's memory, to connect with others despite his grief, and to carry forward the lessons he had learned about courage and resilience. The friendship with Prince George had given him more than comfort during his darkest period. It had reminded him of his own capacity for growth, connection, and service to others. The young prince's consistent kindness had served as a bridge between the devastation of losing Emma and the possibility of a future where he could experience joy and purpose while still carrying his love for his daughter. 6 months later, Thomas sent a letter to Windsor Castle addressed to Prince George. In it, he described his successful transition to Balmoral, his growing friendships with new colleagues, and his gradual return to a version of himself that honored both his grief and his capacity for happiness. He wrote about volunteer work he had begun with a local children's charity, inspired by Emma's belief in the power of kindness to change lives. Most importantly, he wrote about how the lessons he had learned through their friendship continued to guide his daily interactions with others. He had become known at Balmoral for his particular attention to staff members who seemed to be struggling with personal challenges, offering the same kind of non-judgmental support that Prince George had shown him during his darkest period. The letter concluded with these words, "Your Royal Highness, you once told me that the best friendships help both people become who they're meant to be. I want you to know that through your kindness, I have remembered who I am at my core, not just Emma's father, though I will always be that, but also someone capable of offering love and support to others who are struggling to find their way. Thank you for seeing that person in me when I had forgotten he existed." Prince George read the letter multiple times, each reading reinforcing his understanding of the profound impact that simple human kindness could have on someone's life. The experience of befriending Thomas had taught him lessons about empathy, resilience, and the responsibility that comes with recognizing others' pain that would serve him well throughout his life. Years later, when Prince George had grown into his role as a future monarch, he would often reference the friendship with Thomas when speaking about the importance of seeing beyond superficial differences to recognize the common humanity that connects all people. The lessons learned from a grieving guard during his childhood would inform his approach to public service and his understanding of the transformative power of authentic human connection. The silent gesture that had begun their relationship, a simple acknowledgement of another person's worth and dignity, had rippled outward in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Thomas's healing had enabled him to help countless others through his volunteer work and his changed approach to daily interactions. Prince George's natural empathy had been refined and strengthened through witnessing the impact of consistent kindness on someone who desperately needed it. Their friendship had proved that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest acts of recognition and care, and that the courage to see and respond to another person's need can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. In a world often marked by division and indifference, their connection had demonstrated the enduring power of human compassion to bridge any gap and heal even the deepest wounds. The story of Prince George and Thomas would be remembered not as an extraordinary tale of royal benevolence, but as a perfect example of what becomes possible when people choose to see each other clearly, respond to need with generosity, and trust that love really can triumph over loss. Their friendship had left everyone who witnessed it, from castle staff to family members to readers of their story, with renewed faith in the transformative power of genuine human kindness.